Hey guys, thought I'd do another quick video on a cold weather setup for the MWS. It's a question I get all the time, and it's something I've honestly been meaning to do for a couple years now. But it's good because I do have some more thoughts now than I did, say, last year. I guess I want to get into kind of the theory behind it, but for the impatient ones out there, let me just go ahead and spout out the parts that I would recommend upgrading for a cold weather setup. But go ahead and stay tuned after if you want to kind of hear some more theory and why behind it. So really the main things that you could do in my mind is a lightweight bolt, a lightweight buffer, and a lightweight Z plate. So essentially you want to lighten the recoil system, operating system, since during the winter and cold weather, you don't have the gas pressures you do at, say, normal temps or even hotter temps in the summer. So the system just struggles to cycle and operate as it normally does. So you can alleviate that by lightening the weight of, again, the bolt, the buffer, and even the Z plate, so that those things can all work a little easier with less gas pressure. So that's the basic principle behind it, I suppose. The Z plate, I think, is an overlooked part of that equation, because a lighter Z plate, one, that it can be used year round, so it's a good upgrade. And I recommend the BavTac Z plate. He not only lightened it up using titanium, which is amazing, but also changed the geometry of it so that if you look at it compared to your stock Z plate, the point of contact where it contacts the bolt lock is actually closer. What that means is that the bolt doesn't need to cycle as far back to reach bolt lock, and it'll still cycle and function, cycle BBs just fine. But it's ever so much shorter travel than the stock one, which means you can short stroke the gun, or if you are short stroking the gun, it'll still bolt lock, or in the case that your bolt just isn't cycling all the way to the rear due to, say, lower gas pressures from cold weather, it won't have to travel as far to reach that bolt lock, right? So that's a really good upgrade. As far as buffers, I tend to use the stock plastic buffer in the winter. You can get away with like a lighter weight aluminum one. I found that, even with a heavy buffer, I was still able to use it down. That night was around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and it still cycled and functioned fine and bolt locked. But you lost all that extra recoil you normally get from using a heavy buffer. So there's really no point in my mind. So it feels like a stock plastic buffer. Might as well use the stock plastic buffer because it is lighter weight. It is going to let the system operate easier, more freely. So I tend to use my solid one-piece heavy buffers in spring and summer, 3-season use, and then for cold weather, I'll swap back to the stock plastic buffer. That's worked pretty well for me. But again, you could also just if you're not running a ridiculously heavy metal buffer, then you can keep that and it should be just fine. The stock bolt is actually one of the heavier bolts out there. There's a couple offerings now that actually are heavier, but by and large, when you look at aftermarket bolt carrier, like the Carrier Group, they're all going to be lighter weight versions typically. So any of those would work. I have another video talking about bolts and buffers, but which is pretty long. But just know that pretty much any lightweight bolt should work. A lot of times you are expected to swap out parts from your stock one and they're just selling you a shell, so that's something to be aware of. If you want to have two complete bolt setups, you might just buy a complete one. Guns Modify, I believe, sells like their Evo bolt. It's a pretty good deal. I think they're only like $60 complete, or $80 maybe. So I'd probably recommend that one. Or but you can also use the Angry Guns or whatever. Just be aware that if it's not a complete bolt, you will be expected to either swap parts over from your stock bolt, or you'll have to buy some additional parts. And that can be a bit tricky, as no one's really sells, maybe they do now, but be very careful when you're looking at bolt part kits, because not all of them actually include all the parts you need, even though it'll say it's a complete bolt part kit. So that's a little side note there. Another thing I mentioned is the magazines. If you're using P-mags or plastic mags, those are less resistant to cold than the standard metal mags, and they will have cooldown effects a bit more than the standard ones, so something to consider. Another final thing is the bucking. It's debatable, and it's hard to get actual hard evidence on this, but in my mind, I think a silicone bucking could be beneficial. I'm not quite sure that it actually is. But in theory, a silicone bucking won't freeze as quickly as, say, a standard typical rubber bucking. So Modify makes, and they just came out with their new, I believe, X series silicone bucking. So I'm still testing that one, but it seems good. I like Modify. I use their tan bucking for 3 season. They're a bit pricier than others, but maybe a few bucks. Maple Leaf also has a silicone bucking offering, which I was using that last year and had pretty good results with it. They are very thin, so they tend to wear out a bit quicker, but the Modify silicone one seems a bit thicker, so I'm curious to see how that one works this year. I will say that no matter what you do, all these kind of mods, there's still a limit to the system, right? So I've had good days where I was able to push, and I've heard of other stories of guys pushing these things to some pretty cold temps. I've been able to get away with that on certain times. To be honest, I don't have extremely cold days here that we play ourselves too often, maybe a few times a year. But I know that I have taken this out around, say, 30 degrees Fahrenheit, about freezing, and I was having a lot of issues, even with all these modifications. I've also taken a stock MWS down to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit and had no issues. So who knows? Maybe I just had a bad day. And I've also taken this down to, I have taken an MWS down to in the 20 degrees, like sub freezing temps, and it ran good for a couple games. And then really the only downfall was the bucking swelled up, and then my shot started like, I lost all accuracy and range. What I did at that point was just set it down, let it thaw out. I swapped to a different MWS, which was fine. And then after one game, I swapped back to the original one, and it was able to make it through the rest of the day. The temps kind of heated up a little bit in the later morning that day. So, I just hesitate to tell you to go out and spend a couple $100 on parts, and then maybe it still doesn't work. Just be aware that, your mileage may vary. There is a limit to these things, and you might have to fine tune things a bit. Alternatively, if cold weather performance is a very high priority for you, you might consider the AKM. The AKM is, in my experience and others, it's a superior platform for cold weather for whatever reason. I've taken this thing down to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, which is sub-freezing temps, and literally bone stock essentially, and it performed flawlessly all day long. And that same day, I brought an MWS with all the lightweight parts, etc., and it was not having it. It was just not having a good day. So ended up running the AK that entire day and didn't have any issues. I even full auto mag dumped at one point, and while it was a bit sluggish, it got through it all. So the AK is a really good system, I think, for cold weather. Obviously, it's a completely different platform. If you're an M4 guy, I get it. But something to be aware of and consider. The AK works really well in cold weather. I think that just about covers it. I didn't really get into the theory, but I sort of covered it. Let's just nail that out real quick. So going back to the M4 platform, you got to just think about the operating system, right? So you have gas in the magazine. You pull the trigger, presses that valve, releases the gas. That blows up into the bolt, which cycles it rearward, contacts the buffer system in the buffer tube in the stock, which is spring loaded, pushes it back, cycles the next round, so on and so forth. So you have reciprocating mass in the bolt and the buffer, and that's why we recommend going to lightweight bolt and buffers, because when the gas pressure goes down in colder weather, it doesn't have as much resistance having to push all that extra weight back and to cycle the weapon, or not a weapon, the toy. But so that's the theory, right? If you have lighter weight bolt and buffer, it's easier. It's just an easier system to cycle, which is going to be beneficial when you don't have the pressures that you normally have due to the cold weather and due to how that affects gas. So in a nutshell, that's it. Some other things you might consider could be some high flow valves. I've never messed with my magazines, to be honest, like that. But potentially you could add some higher flow valves, which is going to let more gas into the system. in theory. But you'd have to do that to all your magazines, and that can be a bit expensive. And I don't know. That's something that interests me. I haven't tried it yet. But then again, like I said, with my experience, how the one day my bucking froze up, it wasn't any real issue with the system cycling per se. It wasn't that the gas pressure wasn't enough to cycle the system. The weak point in that situation was the bucking itself just got too freezing cold because of how cold it was outside, and you're blasting freezing cold, gas into that rubber bucking, and eventually it just hardened up to the point where it was essentially frozen, and it lost its capability to perform how the bucking is supposed to perform. So in my mind, that became the new weak point in the system, which was why I started experimenting with silicone buckings. And like I said, I've had mixed results with that. At first, I thought it was kind of the answer, but then I've had that other day I told you about where I went out, and even with that, it still wasn't working. And that was a really cool day too. But anyways, just some considerations there, guys. Hope that helps you. Yeah, again, as far as the lightweight bolt, you can go any brand pretty much. In my mind, just be aware you might want to get a complete one, so you have two complete bolts you can swap out for summer and winter. That's ideal in my mind. For the buffer, stock plastic works fine. If you have that still, just run that, or a very lightweight one-piece aluminum buffer. And then the Zep plate, I do recommend the Babtac Zep plate. I think that's a good one. So hope that helps, guys. Take it easy.